Hi, my name is Fabrice Soudard, and I'm the Director for Equality Initiatives at Out Leadership. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Mike O'Loughlin. Mike is a long friend of mine, but the reason we are together today is that his first book is coming out called Hidden Mercy. And I feel that this is a very relevant book, and so I wanted to take a minute to have a bit of a discussion with Mike on how the book came to be, but also what is the message for our community at this juncture. So Mike, first of all, thank you so much for giving us some of your time. I know you're busy with the Catholic beat, but do you mind giving us a little bit of your background? If I remember well, you did cover Catholic news for the Boston Globe, and then now you're at America Magazine. But can you tell us a little bit how this career came to be?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me. It's good to see you. Yeah, I cover the Catholic Church in the United States, mostly what our church leaders doing politically in the public square. There's getting ready for this big meeting between Pope Francis and Joe Biden that's happening in Rome. So that's sort of my natural beat. I came to cover Catholicism because I grew up Catholic. I find the institution fascinating, kind of the way it can shape civil discourse in this country and around the world. I started reporting professionally as Pope Francis was coming on the scene. So it was a global player who was reinvigorating the church. And as a gay person myself, it was interesting, it was a word for it, to see how the church was really impacting the debate around things like same-sex marriage in the United States. And I wanted to cover that mostly so I could understand what it meant to be a gay person in the Catholic Church today. So that's what I've been doing for the past 10 years or so. In the past few years, working on this topic that we'll talk about, that I cover in the book, the church's response to HIV and AIDS. And
you studied theology, right?
I did. I went to a Benedictine school for college and studied theology there, and then did a master's at Yale Divinity School and studied more theology. For a while, I thought I'd want to be a professor, but changed my mind pretty quickly, and that's how I fell into religion journalism.
I thought you were going to say a priest when you started,
No, that was something I think all Catholic kids probably think about a little bit, but that ended pretty early for me.
But you say fascinating, but in the book, you actually also mentioned that there was suffering in having to reconcile the identity of growing up Catholic and being gay.
Yeah, it's not something that came particularly easy. In the book, I write about how it all felt very new to me as I was growing up. And then when I went off to college and I was looking at how Catholic leaders were really fighting hard against same-sex marriage, it felt like a new phenomenon where you had gay rights activists who were more vocal, demanding change, demanding their rights, and then Catholic leaders kind of pushing very hard back. And then I'm in the middle somewhere as someone who is part of the LGBT community, but also part of the church, and trying to understand where I fit in. It just felt new, and I didn't know where to turn. I didn't know who to talk to. I didn't know if people had done this before. And that's when I started reaching out to people who were a bit older than me, maybe had a couple of decades of experience on me. And I found out that this wasn't new at all. And perhaps it was even more dramatic in the 1980s, because you had similar fights taking place, civil rights versus church authorities, but against the backdrop of HIV and AIDS, which created this very difficult time for gay Catholics who are now in their 50s, 60s, 70s. And those are the people I reached out to for advice, so I didn't feel so alone.
That's interesting because, in my experience, people of my generation, I'm a bit older than you, maybe by 10 years. People of my generation, they tended, and I grew up Catholic, they tended to be like, well, if the church doesn't accept me fully, then I'm just going to get rid of all aspects of religion and spirituality in my life. And then, the tendency is maybe, as we age, we start going back to spirituality, but that hasn't been your experience, because in a way, first of all, you didn't really reject your faith. And then the other aspect, which is kind of striking in the book, is that you don't seem to have any anger toward the church, despite the fact that, as you mentioned, it did end up playing a huge role in what being gay means in the United States?
Yeah, I do. I don't know if this is my personality or because I've been studying it for so long, but the book itself too, I do give the context of what was happening, of the institutional church, which I think did not do a good job in responding to HIV and AIDS. It really undermined the public health efforts. It fought against civil rights bills that would have protected gay men diagnosed with HIV. But I was more interested, what was more interesting to me was the Catholics who did the right thing anyway. So gay priests who came out and sided with the LGBT community while ministering to men with AIDS, or nuns who really stepped up and provided pastoral care. And I found that interesting because there was this tendency at the time in the 80s and 90s that when young men mostly were getting sick and dealing with questions that a lot of people are fortunate not to have to deal with until they're older, in their 70s and 80s, but questions of mortality and what is life's purpose and suffering, they were cut off from spiritual resources. They just weren't made available, right? Because the church said, no, you're not welcome here. So there was this awful scenario where there might have been people who had left the church, but maybe would have come back later on had they survived longer. But at that point in their life, they could have used those resources and they were told, no, you're not worthy to receive them. And that was incredibly difficult. So I was interested in who are the people who were doing the right things at the time. And yeah, I think I probably papered over some anger in the book because I was focused on these more positive stories, but it's not been easy all the time. I've been fortunate to have a lot of friends who are Catholic, who are also part of the LGBT community, who have made that work, who have sort of served as mentors to me, even priests I know who have been very welcoming and affirming of my identity, my relationship with my husband. So we've had a good experience. And I try to remember that that can be fairly unique. Not everyone has that experience. And in fact, the church can be fairly harmful to LGBT people even today.
You know, I see I'm a terrible interviewer because I actually didn't even mention the title of the book. So the book is called Hidden Mercy. And when is it coming out?
November 30th.
And it's available on Amazon right now for pre-ordering, or
yeah, pre-ordering is super helpful to get word of the book out. You can order it through Amazon or any local bookstore.
Great. You know, yeah, because a lot of people actually do say, you know, why go directly to Amazon when there is other way to get books. And so, you know, to summarize a little bit what the book is about is that it looks at the fact that there was an institutional response to HIV. And in fact, a lot of ACT UP, you know, which you discussed in the book, a lot of ACT UP initiatives were directed at the church at the time because of the public stance of the church. But also the book is also probably even more looking at the individual response of priests, of nuns, of even Catholic laymen and laywomen that responded to the pandemic. Is that a good summary of the book?
Yeah, I can tell you've read it, so I appreciate that.
So what I think is also an incredible message in the book for us gay people is that you basically say, do not look at the church as a monolith. That in a way, what the hierarchy might be saying might be very different than what a parishioner is saying. And, you know, why do you think that we tend to look at the Catholic Church as the Pope, the Vatican, as being, you know, this one voice, when it's actually much more nuanced than that?
The nuance is important, and I don't want to sort of let powerful church leaders off the hook for what they were saying and doing in the 1980s. I mean, you had all the way up from Pope John Paul II, who didn't even acknowledge HIV and AIDS until 1987, so several years into the epidemic. Down at the more local level, you had archbishops, powerful cardinals who were actively fighting gay civil rights bills. And what they do is important because they're leaders, and leadership, I mean, as you know, there's responsibilities that come with leadership. And of course, words from a pope or an archbishop are going to carry more weight with ordinary believers, people in the press, than someone, you know, the average Catholic in a pew, no matter how heroic the work he or she's doing. So I don't want to paint a picture where I think, the church was actually doing a great thing. There were individual Catholics and even some organizations who responded really well, but ultimately the institution had a response, and it was pretty bleak at times. One anecdote that keeps coming to my mind is in New York, there was a push for a gay civil rights bill. And part of it was they wanted the city to recognize relationships so that if a man were diagnosed with HIV and developed AIDS, he could stay on his partner's health insurance once he lost his job. Now, that's a basic human right, the right to healthcare. And you had the church fighting against that because they said that this recognizing the relationship was too close to marriage. And of course, the church is against same-sex marriage. But I mean, that's a really troubling position for an archbishop to take. And he knows, this is Cardinal John O'Connor I'm talking about, he knew firsthand how HIV and AIDS was devastating the gay community because he did visit patients, people who had AIDS in the Catholic hospitals in the city. So to take that stand, there are severe real world effects that a leader's actions has. But at the same time, and this is again where I spend most of my energy in the book, there were people, Catholic sisters, priests, lay people, LGBT people in the church who were really stepping up and doing the hard work of, bringing meals to people too sick to leave their homes, or managing doctor's appointments, helping them get the access to medication, providing the spiritual resources I talked about, which I think is something that hasn't been as widely reported yet. So there are these good acts going on, but again, the context is important against a very difficult situation created by some church leaders.
One thing that is kind of surprising in the book, and not really surprising if you think long about it, but in a way that is not often talked about, is the fact that priests themselves sometimes were sick, and that some people did extend within the church, their hand to support them. And when you talk about this beautiful house that was created in which basically priests could come to die, can you tell us a little more about that? And was it difficult to uncover the stories, given the fact that it's probably the most taboo topic you can imagine?
Priests being infected with HIV and dying from AIDS was a phenomenon that was reported on in the press as far back as the mid-1980s. It's something that was fairly well known because there were articles in the LA Times and New York Times that there were at least some priests who had contracted HIV. It's still a topic I think a lot of church leaders don't want to talk about. And obviously the taboo is that Catholic priests are supposed to be celibate. Gay men are not, under official church teaching, are not supposed to be ordained to the priesthood. So if you have this phenomenon where there is a significant cohort of priests contracting HIV, thus in some capacities or some instances outing them, it is creating a difficult situation for the church. And at the time, church leaders simply denied it. In one instance we know of, an archbishop actually changed the death certificate of a priest who died from AIDS because there was this sense of shame and scandal attached to it. But again, like you pointed out, there was this other response happening at the same time. There were communities of religious men who were responding to a member getting sick with AIDS in really compassionate ways, welcoming him home, maybe if he had left the order. And then there's this house you talked about that a group of religious created in Oakland, California, and wanted priests to move there to spend their final days in dignity. Now, the sad part of that story is that even though there was this known phenomenon of priests contracting HIV, there was too much shame and stigma, and the house couldn't find any who were willing to move into the house. Eventually, it became a hospice for ordinary people with HIV and AIDS to move into. But the shame and stigma around the issue was strong. I think there's still a sense that this should be a secret, despite widespread reporting about it in the late 90s into the 2000s. But I was able to find some instances where priests knew that if they went public with their own diagnosis, it could help lessen that shame and stigma. And I was able to report out a story of one priest here in Chicago who used his funeral mass as a way to let people know how he died in hopes that it would offer comfort to others in similar situations.
One of the things that struck me is that you pointed out at the beginning of of our talk that you cover a wide range of topics. There is always a new topic that is coming up, and sometimes not even related to LGBTQ issues. But the reason why you focused on this one, at some point you mentioned, is because of the feeling that those stories are about to disappear forever. Can you tell us a little bit more about, when you came to that realization that, well, if I don't collect the stories, they will be lost forever?
Yeah, part of it is just time, right? So the height of the crisis, in terms of how I define it in the book, is about 1982 to 1996. So we're talking 30 years ago at this point, and people have aged. If you were working in this field, you were in your 40s, you're in your 70s or 80s now, and we've lost a lot of people who just haven't shared their stories yet. I was always shocked as I was interviewing people who did really heroic things at this time, that they told me over and over again that no one's asked about these stories in a long time. So they did the work, and then society kind of just moved on, and we pretend that HIV and AIDS is something that happened in the past, so why go back to that? That's simply not true. So many of these stories have not been collected, and that was part of my motivation. And it really hit home for me. We were writing, I was writing a chapter about St. Vincent's Hospital in New York. It was a Catholic hospital founded by the Sisters of Charity that was located in Greenwich Village. So it sort of just happened to be in an area that was truly the epicenter of HIV and AIDS early in the crisis. It was a hospital that struggled at first. How do we respond to a gay community? This isn't the community that we know very well. And there was a series of protests by ACT UP, a number of meetings, and eventually the hospital came around and really was a welcoming place for the LGBT community during the height of the AIDS crisis. So I'm writing the story, we're doing interviews, and I interviewed a surgeon who worked at the hospital in the 1980s and 90s who heard some of the homophobia, some of the sort of casual homophobia among the medical staff. And he winced and tried to push back when he could. And he was just kind of giving us a glimpse into what life at the hospital was like. A few months went by when I received notice from some of the representatives from the former hospital who said he had passed away unexpectedly. So this great resource, this doctor, this surgeon, who had a front row seat of what this storied Catholic hospital was doing at the time, who hadn't really told his story yet. He was fairly young, in his 60s, and I think he had plans to go more into what it was like working at the hospital at that time. But if we hadn't captured his story, we wouldn't have known what he saw back then. And that kind of played out over and over again. There's a main character in the book, a Catholic nun named Carol Baltashevitz, who really led the way for HIV and AIDS care in Southern Illinois. And she did so with another Catholic sister named Mary Ellen Rombach. And Carol's story, along with Mary Ellen's, is fascinating and takes up maybe a third of the book. But Mary Ellen actually passed away about 4 or 5 years before I started researching the project. So another example of just a front row seat of this unique time in history that is lost because Mary Ellen didn't sit down to tell her story in a comprehensive way.
Yeah, so that brings me actually to a question I have, which is, as you can imagine, I work with a lot of young people in companies now, and very often they say, why would I join my employer resource group? I don't really have any issue. Then similarly, as you mentioned, even though HIV remains a huge global problem, it has pretty much been solved for affluent white gay men in urban areas. And then similarly, I just saw Alan Cumming in a recent article being quoted as saying, we don't need to come out anymore. And so my question to you is, why do you think it's important for gay people to be in touch with their history?
I think that's a hugely important question. I didn't see the article about the importance of coming out, but I found, at least in spaces where the LGBT issue is still considered controversial or taboo, like it is in the church, I think coming out is hugely important because there are in the Catholic Church, there are so many LGBT people who are too afraid to come out because of repercussions. Sometimes it might mean being fired from a job or being kicked out of a parish that you find life-giving and edifying. So there's this need, I think, to make people aware of just how many LGBT people there are in society and in the church. In terms of history, I was shocked to learn this history. There was this sense where I knew all this data. I knew that the church had been discriminatory toward LGBT people. I had known about gay Catholic groups being kicked out of Catholic parishes. I knew about the Vatican letter that came out in October 1986 that condemned homosexuality in very explicit terms. And these different data points all existed in my head, but I never connected the dots to figure out this was all happening against the backdrop of HIV and AIDS, which sort of further heightened the horror that church leaders were doing this thing at a time when the gay community felt under siege. And just understanding that basic history helps me see those events in a different lens. But on a personal level, and it's a little greedy about why I did this project, I wanted to know this for myself. This roadmap that I didn't have about how to stay in an institution that I do find valuable, I do find meaning in, and I'm glad the church is around. But as a gay man myself, it wasn't always easy to be part of that. And not knowing that I didn't have to do this on my own, that there were other people who have had similar experiences, forming those friendships, learning the history, learning the stories, that's been hugely edifying. So when the Vatican comes out and says that priests cannot bless same-sex unions because God does not bless sin, and this happened a few months ago, I can say, okay, that feels like a gut punch. It feels new, but something similar happened 35 years ago, and here's how the people I interviewed dealt with it. So it is this sense that there's solidarity through our past.
No, and I like that, and I have to say that something that is a bit emotional in the book is this kind of reconciliation with spirituality, right? That spirituality is not just proclamation; it's basically daily living. And one of the things that I love to say is that I think one of the cruelest things that has been done to LGBTQ plus people is to kick them out of places of worship, because spirituality, we all need spirituality, right? And in a way, there's so many studies that show that people that have faith or have a spiritual connection tend to have better outcomes in life. And as you know, there is higher rate of addiction, there is higher rate of suicide, and sometimes depression and anxiety in the community. And we don't always have access to places that can nurture our spirituality. And so that's one of the things that I love about the book, is that the message is, spirituality is not so much just proclamation, it's the living of the scripture, right?
Yeah, I had been working on this project for several years, and I was trying to get at something like that, but I couldn't quite articulate it. And then just a few months ago, I came across an interview the actor Billy Porter gave promoting his new book. And he kind of said that one of the first things that happens when you come out is that you're cut off from your spiritual resources. And I thought that's exactly it. He was able to articulate in one sentence what I've been after for years. So I appreciated that. But there is this sense, especially among I talked to several long-term survivors of HIV who are Catholic, who were kind of have stepped in and out of the church as different events occurred throughout their lives. And they're now facing this new phenomenon of aging with HIV. And they are doing so without the support networks that people might have. Their friends in their 20s and 30s, many of them passed away. They were kicked out of their churches, and they're facing aging with this new reality without the strong sense of support or spiritual support. So they are forming, many of them are forming their own communities. They're finding welcoming Catholic parishes. They're starting support groups. But they told me that not having access to those spiritual communities was a huge burden. And many of them were too angry to go back, but they knew that what the church had to offer was something they wanted. So they fought to carve their own spaces. And I think for people like me, younger LGBT people in religious spaces, we have them to thank, but we often don't know who they are and we don't know their stories.
Yeah, so you mentioned the fact that you worked on it for a long time. And what I loved about the book is that it reads a bit like a detective novel, because you kind of stumble upon some things and then you explore them, and you kind of have breakthrough. And one of the questions I had is, how did you finance this? Because it does look like it involved a lot of travel and basically expenses. So how did you finance your research?
Well, if there's anyone out there who wants to help finance continuing investigation, they're welcome to contact me. But I was very lucky that a lot of my travel for work, my writing at America, I would tack on interviews if I were in a city. In 2019, America magazine, the Jesuit publication where I work, very generously allowed me the time and space to create a podcast featuring some of these stories, which is still available. It's called Plague, Untold Stories of AIDS in the Catholic Church. I think it has the unique distinction of being a project that was honored with awards from the LGBT Journalists Association and the Catholic Press Association. I don't think there's been much overlap between the two organizations in the past, but this allowed me to get out there, interview dozens and dozens of people, put them into a podcast, and many of the stories in the podcast are featured in Hidden Mercy. But yeah, it was a years-long effort with starts and stops. Lots of publishers said no initially. I thought the project had died several times, but thankfully the podcast and then the book now are reaching a wide number of people. And the emails I get from people who tell me that they haven't shared stories about what their life was like in the 1980s and 90s, or people they know who died from AIDS-related complications, really offering heartfelt, emotional emails with me has been overwhelming. And it has led, like you said, this detective sort of theme in the book where it just keeps uncovering more and more stories. So I don't think the book is the end. I'm hoping that it's the start of a conversation and we can start to explore maybe why we don't tell these stories in the Catholic Church, but maybe there's a space now where we can start to talk about it more freely.
Well, and I think it's really important that you've documented that, you know, and that there is kind of a compendium that says, look, this is what happened. And actually, it will bring me to a question: is that there is exceptional individuals in the book, right? That don't even hesitate in finding what is the right thing to do, right? And you know, it's interesting because very recently I was stumbling upon the story of this father, of this priest in France called Père Mathieu. I don't know if you've heard about him. He's an extremely popular TikTok priest, and he said in one of his videos that you know, being gay is not a sin. And you know, of course, the hierarchy was not happy. His fellow priests were not happy. And you know, he kind of stood by his video, and which actually is pretty amazing because it shows that there is room for dissent in the church, and other, you know, preconception we have that you cannot dissent within the church. But my question to you is, what do you think is the commonality of those priests and nuns that took risk, that went to some extent against their hierarchy? You know, what makes them the exceptional people that in time of crisis live by their principles?
That's a great question that I don't have an answer to, and it's something I've been struggling to figure out as well. I recently was in Syracuse, New York, visiting a gay Catholic couple named Michael and Nick, who in the 1990s, 1992, they turned their house into a hospice for people dying from AIDS. Michael and Nick are gay and Catholic, and they told me it wasn't easy, that they faced a lot of opposition, they couldn't get much support. And I asked Michael that exact question. I said, why did you respond in this way? You literally had just moved in with your boyfriend to this big home. You encountered a man who was homebound, very weak, dying from AIDS, and you invited him back to your house. You hadn't planned on this. You didn't ask your partner about this. You just did it. And I said, what is it that makes you do that? And his response was, well, anyone would have done that if you had seen what I had seen. And that's obviously not true. I mean, most people didn't do anything, and I don't know how many people would respond to that even today. So I did press him a little bit. It's my job to ask follow-up questions, and I did. But he went back to his faith. He said that as a Catholic, he takes the teachings of Jesus seriously, and when he encountered someone who was sick, he offered care. Most Christians don't live up to the ideals that the religion teaches, myself included. But there is something about everyone I've interviewed. There's this sort of quiet humility that permeates their story. There's something that they take their faith very seriously. I wish I could understand it better. I wish it's something I could live up to myself. It's not, but that seems to be the underlying motivation. And it is a topic I would like to explore further, because there's something about this quiet courage that is very needed today, I think.
And you know, what's interesting is that it's actually not, you know, it could be priests and nuns that have same-sex attraction, but in fact, it tends to be completely straight people that comes out pretty clearly in the story. And you know, you start with that story of a nun that basically has to learn about gay sex and gay culture. It's actually kind of cringe-worthy because, you know, we tend, as gay people, we tend to try to portray a very normative way of life, and then there's some aspects of our life, like the hookup apps or, you know, the culture that we never really portray to anybody. And that nun is like, no, I want to understand so that I can be of service, which is pretty fascinating.
Yeah, that's Carol's story, and you're exactly right. I mean, she was not comfortable with this, but something about her didn't let her give up. I think it would have been very easy to be scared by the unknown, right? But she didn't give up. She kept at it. She put herself in awkward, uncomfortable conversations, but she eventually learned and understood what she needed to do about the community, and became a fierce ally for the LGBT community in Southern Illinois.
So, you know, one question I had for you too is, when you write something, there is always people that are not happy. Did you get criticism from anybody, or are people like, no, this is perfect, this is factual?
I hope it's perfectly factual. We'll find out when it comes out and people start to scrutinize it. But no, there's always some critical or nasty messages I get. There's still sort of a homophobic streak in the church, so I'm not immune to that, especially on social media. I will say my favorite piece of criticism, though, was there was a review of one of the podcast episodes by a really sort of right-wing, homophobic, nominally Catholic website, and the review said that he found the stories very powerful, that it was very well done, that they enjoyed learning these stories. But because it was pro-gay, they didn't like it and had to be condemned. So I'll take it. I mean, if I'm reaching that audience and they like the work and the production value, that's a win for me.
That's great. And so what do you hope with the book? That it will give readers, you know, maybe a more positive view of religion and spirituality? Do you hope for, you know, people remembering that this was such a horrible moment and that some people behave heroically? What is your hope in you know, in the impact you may have with this book?
That's a great question. I think there's a lot of hopes I have about this book. One is I hope that if there are LGBT people who feel as if they want to be part of a religious community of the Catholic Church, that this will offer them sort of motivation or encouragement to keep at it, that this has been a decades-long fight, even longer than that, for religious people who are part of the LGBT community, that it is possible to be an LGBT person and be part of a faith community. So that's one. The other is I think that in order to understand how society responded to HIV and AIDS, you have to understand how the Catholic Church responded, because that was a big part of especially the healthcare network in the United States at the time. And there is, I think, sort of a superficial understanding of how the church responded when it comes to our general sense of history. But I don't think, even if these stories weren't the main stories of what the institution was doing, this is part of the church's response. And I think these stories, these experiences deserve to be told alongside the more disappointing aspects of how the church responded. So capturing these stories and adding it to the historical record is certainly a goal of the project.
Yeah, and you know, I think another aspect that struck me, that it's also a bit of a call for courage and heroism. And you know, that's interesting because actually I was just looking at it now, but I have on my desk a picture of Stephen Gandin getting arrested. And I wonder if it's not when he's getting arrested in the demonstration at the New York Cathedral you talk about in the book. But you know, very often when I tell those young people that tell me, oh, I don't really need to join an unemployed resource group, or I don't really need to come out, is where the vast majority of LGBTQ plus people are continuing to suffer, right? And particularly the most marginalized among us. And we are called to be heroes because the people before us did have to show heroism to deal with gigantic bottlenecks, including the HIV epidemic. And you know, the book kind of makes you want to be a better person because a lot of those people were incredibly selfless and in a way were never really thanked for what they did, right? They just did it and then they retired.
Yeah, and that's part of it. There was this sort of humility, this quiet devotion to the cause. But yeah, a lot of them simply either stepped away from HIV and AIDS ministry when pharmaceutical advances meant that there wasn't as much of a need for this kind of work. Others simply retired, and their stories are going with them. So there is this sense that these are ordinary people who did extraordinary things in the 1980s and 90s. And there is this sense that, yes, we have to step up when we encounter similar crises in our time, which there's no shortage of issues that we could contribute to today. So I'm glad to hear that you found it encouraging, because it is a heavy topic, but there are inspiring moments within it.
One question I have for you, you do mention that there's still a lot to uncover. Have you thought about making it into a documentary?
I have. I think it would actually be a great movie. I think Carol's story is just filled with drama and great storytelling. Carol's a natural storyteller. So some kind of movie or a documentary, I think, is a natural next step. So yeah, anyone who's able to do that and wants to work with me, I welcome a conversation.
Great. Well, listen, first of all, congratulations, because it does take hard work and dedication to come with such a book, and second of all, I love it that you are a little bit, you are the person that is living in between those two worlds, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of amazing that you bridge those two worlds that tend to ignore each other a lot. So I think it's a great book, Hidden Mercy, and we will definitely promote it on our side. And thank you so much for spending time with us.
Thanks, Fabrice.